Hello, and welcome to Under 1000. My name's Thomas Flower, and each episode I'll read you a new piece of flash fiction. All of the stories are 1000 words or less. Today, I'll be reading Moving Day. It was finally time to leave. John could hardly believe it. Although he'd known what was coming, he didn't expect it to happen so fast. Somehow, he felt like he should have some more time. Sighing gently, he picked out the last few things from his wardrobe and finished the final pieces of packing left. John still remembered just how he had felt when he had moved into the flat 2 years ago. It had seemed at the time as though his big break was finally upon him. He had moved to begin a job in an industry he had long dreamed of entering. It had only been a very junior position, of course, but still, at the time it seemed to him to be a sign of big things to come. He sighed as he gathered a bunch of socks from a drawer and shoved them into a bag. He wondered what had happened to that naive part of himself that so strongly believed his big break was just around the corner. Still, perhaps 2 years wasn't enough time, he reasoned. You couldn't get everything you wanted so quickly, after all. But after so much effort spent organizing calendars, filing reports, and doing coffee runs, John was starting to feel burnt out with it all. When was he finally going to move from being the office lackey to getting to make some of the creative decisions he craved? 2 years ago, he'd been filled with wonder and excitement at what was to come. Now, he only wondered if anything was coming at all. And if so, when? Still, John tried to reassure himself, at least he'd always had his friends. When he'd first moved into the place, he'd managed to convince Rachel and Emmett to move with him. The three had been inseparable, stretching as far back as childhood, and having them come along for this new part of his life had been a great comfort to him at the time. In fact, despite his assertion that he had convinced them, neither had really needed much talking around. Determined to stick together, and keen to experience big city life also, both had jumped at the chance to finally move in and become the dream flatmates they knew they were destined to be. Dream flatmates they were not, however. John had quickly learned that being best friends with someone did not necessarily mean that it was a good idea to live with them. Turns out Rachel, so charming and debonair in their friendship, was secretly a massive slob, and Emmett, meanwhile, unable to find work for several months, had resorted to sitting around the flat in his pants playing video games. Bad blood had been brewed over stacks of dishes left scattered and portions of bills going unpaid. Now that the three of them were going their separate ways, perhaps the relationships could properly recover. But John had learned, absolutely, that the people you wanted to be friends with were not necessarily the same ones you wanted to live with. Suddenly, John realized that his melancholy and nostalgia was for nothing. What had he been holding on to so strongly with this place? A bad time doing a job that made him miserable and living with people he loved but who ultimately annoyed him. That was surely nothing to get emotional over. Perhaps moving on was better. No, in fact, moving on was definitely better. At least now he was free to create the kind of situation he'd actually want to live in. Why be sad about leaving a place you never enjoyed being in? But then, suddenly, and unexpectedly, John's mind flashed back to the time he and Rachel had tried to throw a party for Emmett. They had spent all day, while Emmett was out with friends, baking a cake, stocking the fridge with beers, and looking for events that evening that they could drag Emmett to as a celebration of his birthday. They'd taken such care, planning it all out meticulously, trying to give him the very best party they possibly could. And then, as things so often seem to in their flat, it had all gone wrong. Emmett took several hours longer than expected to come back from seeing his friends. Bored of waiting, their plans laid out already, John and Rachel had cracked into the booze, promising each other it would only be for one drink. An hour later, the two of them thoroughly hammered, Rachel had sprung up upon hearing the sound of keys in the lock. She and John had scurried quickly behind the living room door, cake held between them, waiting to surprise an unsuspecting Emmett. As he came through, Rachel jumped out too early, simultaneously causing John to drop his half of the cake and accidentally battering Emmett in the nose with the door. Blood and cake now covering the floor, they had scrabbled as a group to clean up and make sure they were all okay. Nobody ended up going out that night. Once nerves were calmed, pizza was ordered, and they had consumed large amounts of it along with the end of the beer and what could be salvaged of the cake. It was all rather tragic, but in a good way, somehow. John smiled as he remembered it now. Maybe even the bad times had had their good elements. Sighing once more, he began shifting his bags from his room to the hallway, preparing, finally, to leave for good. He wondered how he should be feeling. With his emotions in a whirl as they had been, it was difficult to tell. As he carried the last bag away and closed the door behind him, he decided to let the memories be what they were and to move on to something different. He didn't know if it would be better or worse, but he knew life carried on. Thank you for listening to Under 1000. I'm your host, Thomas Flower. To follow the show online, look for Under 1000 Pod on Twitter or Facebook, or check out the website at under1000pod.com. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/under1000pod, where you can sign up to read each month's stories in advance, as well as to have a thank you be read during these credits. The theme music is an instrumental version of In Between Days by Nick Tate and the Sharks. To hear the full song, and more from the same EP, go to Nick Tate, Nictate, and thesharks.bandcamp.com, or search for them on your favourite streaming platform. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you'll join me again next time for some more super short fiction.